In the treatment of refugees in the European Union, the issue of resettlement continues to play an insignificant role. Taking the European border regime, also known as Fortress Europe, into consideration throws this inattention into the spotlight and leads us to ask what share European values have in the so-called migrant crisis. In the following presentation, in the hope of supporting new and further thought, discussion and action, we will highlight several pressing contradictions in this context.
According to the European Commission in 2015, 900,000 people landed on the shores of Italy and Greece. They were mostly young males, a quarter of them of minor age, with only a fifth of those landed being women. About 3,800 did not reach the European shore, having died in their attempts to cross the Mediterranean Sea. Many moved onwards to Central and Western Europe in a pattern of movement that was to become known as a European refugee crisis. As one European country after another argued for lower refugee acceptance rates and increased deportations, the question presented itself: was the whole world fleeing to Europe? According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, in 2015, 65.3 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide as a result of persecution, conflict, generalized violence and other human rights violations. 16.1 million of them were considered to be international refugees. By the end of 2015, not a single EU member country was among the 10 countries hosting the largest numbers of refugees. The top 10 countries included 5 from the Middle East and 5 from Sub-Saharan Africa. Together, they hosted more than half of the world's refugees.
Resettlement programs were first organized to find a safe and durable solution for millions of displaced Europeans after World War II, transporting many of these people across the world's oceans and often far away from the European continent. Today, with large numbers of similarly displaced people attempting to cross the ocean in opposite direction, European governments are less keen to find resettlement solutions. In 2015, states worldwide transferred 107,000 refugees via resettlement programs, with or without UNHCR's assistance. 66,500 of these were admitted to the United States alone. In summer of the same year and for the following 2 years, the European Council adopted a resettlement scheme that would provide safe and legal resettlement for 22,000 people from conflict zones. Under this initiative, as of the spring of 2017, about 14,000 people have been resettled to the European Union. About 4,000 of them under the terms of a combined resettlement and deportation deal between the European Union and Turkey. In 2015, not even 1 in 100 of these displaced people arriving in Europe were benefiting from a resettlement program. Currently, resettlement is the only way to enter Europe legally to seek refuge. Other kinds of movements continue to be systematically hindered and illegalized by the European border regime, also known as Fortress Europe.
The term Fortress Europe appeared originally in Germany during World War II. It was used to describe the European territory controlled by the German Wehrmacht, which at this time was anticipating invasion by the Allied forces. In the 1990s, journalists and migrant rights activists adopted the term to criticize the militarization of the European border regime. Today, government officials calling for the interruption of people moving to Europe have returned to using the term affirmatively. The basic idea of European migration regime is to encourage the movement of EU citizens within the European Union and to limit, filter and prevent the movement of non-EU citizens into or within the European Union, particularly those who are less wealthy, less white and less economically valuable. The movement of citizens is tagged as mobility, whereas the movement of non-citizens is called migration. Today, the undocumented immigrant in a detention camp and the mobile European citizen are two sides of the same coin. European states within the European Union constantly develop and adapt a vast system of administration, legal regulations, intergovernment deals, policing, surveillance, privately or publicly run camps, prisons, military installations and equipment. This fortress not only affects what happens at the precise external frontier of the European Union, It also involves deals with non-European, often authoritarian governments that forcefully prevent people who are far outside from the continent from moving closer to Europe. Deals like the recent Joint Way Forward agreement between the European Union and Afghanistan facilitate large-scale deportations back to conflict zones in exchange for significant financial support for local regimes. Within EU member states' territory, the control of non-citizens, particularly those who are with a peculiar status, is also part of this border regime. In the summer of 2015, the mass movement of people from Southern Europe towards Central and Western Europe provided a poignant illustration of how the planned, static and stable image of the fortress in fact misrepresents how a necessarily patchy European border system is permanently trying to catch up with the strategies, tactics and knowledge of those attempting to cross borders and those who facilitate such movement. After the experience of 2015, European governments expanded their efforts to reinforce Fortress Europe. In 2016, 550,000 fewer people arrived in the EU via Mediterranean Sea than in 2015. But the number of people who died in the Mediterranean Sea increased by 1,000. Another currently very popular strategy behind reinforcing Fortress Europe is to delegitimize and criminalize refugees and their supporters. In 2015, recruiting agencies were in the habit of sometimes welcoming newly arrived refugees right at the train stations. Volunteers and non-government organizations were needed to compensate for government incapacity or unwillingness to provide the basic services and goods to newly arriving people. In contrast, just 1 year later, public discourse readily singled out particularly young male refugees as a significant threat to public security, and the humanitarian organizations and volunteers who helped them were denounced, even sued, for so much as giving a recently arrived person a ride or even rescuing people on sea.
A currently popular stereotypical image of refugees from the Middle East is that of a poor, young, uneducated, lazy, sexist, testosterone-fueled male, a potential jihadist, rapist, who hustled his way to Europe and is now ripe for preying on others. This image allows the construction of the European in opposite terms. In Austria, newly arriving refugees and claimants have to attend value courses in which they learn, among other things, that in Europe men and women are equal, homosexuals have the same rights as heterosexuals, violence is not the answer to conflict, and education and work are essential to successful integration, even though the same participants may not be allowed to attend school or work legally owing to their status. Interestingly, the term value has its origins in the economic thought of the 18th and 19th century. Economists and moral philosophers like Adam Smith investigated how values are created and how they circulate in an economy. Considered in the context of contemporary Europe, one could ask, for instance, who produces most of the vegetables that Europeans consume every winter? It is mostly migrant workers who grow and harvest such vegetables in huge plantations in the south of Italy and Spain. In the plastic sea of Almeria and El Ejido, at the southern Spanish border, 90% of the workforce are migrant workers, mostly young Africans with precarious status or no regular status in Europe at all. Given their precarious status, they have to deal with harsh working conditions and living conditions, low wages and very limited or no social security. They lack fundamental social rights despite being rather exceptionally well integrated into the production of European values. Some of them even used to produce agricultural goods in their home country. Imports of cheap, subsidized European agricultural products in their home countries have long since destroyed local markets, forcing them to leave the country. So now they produce both what Europeans eat as well as the food of their countrymen back home. Despite of such difficult circumstances, the migrant workers organize in local peasant syndicates like the Sindicato de Obreros del Campo. Their struggle for a decent life is of general importance for all of us. Today, companies question general labor standards when they exploit precarious status of young workers in lowering production costs. European governments cut social security also for European citizens, with the argument that these payments would inspire more young people to move into Europe. Since these attacks on social rights affect all of us directly or indirectly, resistance has to be general too. Therefore, in our struggle we have to transcend the divisions produced by the deadly border regime. Illegal versus legal, economic refugee versus legitimate refugee, and non-citizens versus citizens.
The European border regime will continue to produce more insecurity, exploitation and death for all people in Europe, without generally facilitating legal and safe possibilities of entering Europe and seeking refuge. The contradictions of this border regime will continue to adulterate the situation, substantially increasing effective resettlement programs within European states will not end wars or weaken those in Europe who profit from them. It won't end racism, nor disadvantages trade relations, nor the exploitation of workers with precarious status. But more and better resettlement programs have the potential to save many lives, and to facilitate a better start for some of those